The courtroom doors swung open and two people walked in that nobody expected: a young white lawyer, music, and a white female journalist. They didn't sit in the gallery. They walked straight to the music defense table where a black man in shackles was about to be sentenced to life. The prosecutor whispered, "Who are they?" The answer would, music, shake the entire room. Because the truth behind this case wasn't just about murder, it was about a secret this town had buried for over 20 years. But before we get to that courtroom, before the verdict and the tears and the truth that nearly stayed buried, we need to go back. 21 years back to a man named Samuel Carter and the quiet, impossible choice that changed everything. Samuel was 33 years old the winter it all began. He worked maintenance at Harris Lumber, a wood processing plant on the outskirts of Macon, Georgia. The kind of job that left sawdust in your lungs and calluses on your hands that never fully healed. He had been married once to a woman named Linda, who had a laugh that could fill a room and a stubbornness that matched his own. She died of cancer 2 years before the story starts, and after she was gone, Samuel stopped filling rooms with much of anything. They never had children. The house got quiet. He went to work, came home, sat on the porch, and watched the sun go down over a street where everyone knew his name, but no one really knocked on his door anymore. That was the shape of his life on a cold February evening in 2004 when he stopped at the grocery store on his way home from a double shift. He almost didn't go in. He almost drove straight past. But he needed rice, and rice was on sale, and that was enough of a reason. He saw them before he even reached the entrance. Two children sitting on the metal bench outside the store, a boy and a girl, both white, both underdressed for the weather. The boy looked about 7, the girl maybe 5. Their coats were too thin, their faces flushed red from the cold, but neither of them was crying. The boy had his arm around his sister's shoulder, holding her close with the kind of practiced steadiness that said he had done this many times before. Samuel slowed down. Something about the way the boy held that little girl, not panicked, not dramatic, just firm, like it was his only job in the world, made Samuel stop. Walking all together, he crouched down to their level. "You two waiting on somebody?" The boy, David, looked up at him with gray eyes that carried far too much weight for a 7-year-old. "Our aunt dropped us off this morning. She said she'd be right back." This morning. Samuel looked at the sky. It was already past 5 o'clock. The sun was almost gone. He learned the rest in pieces. Their mother had died 3 weeks earlier from an overdose. Their father had never been in the picture, not even a name on a birth certificate. A maternal aunt had taken temporary custody, but from the sound of it, temporary was generous. She had left them at this grocery store before dawn and hadn't returned. Samuel called the police. He bought the children hot chocolate from the store and sat with them on that freezing bench while they waited. When the cruiser finally pulled up, 2 officers stepped out and immediately fixed their eyes on Samuel, a black man, sitting beside 2 small white children in the dark. Their hands drifted toward their belts before a single question was asked. "Sir, what's your relationship to these children?" Samuel explained. He explained again and then a third time because the first 2 times didn't seem to register as believable. He was just a man who had walked by, just a stranger who had stopped. But the officers looked at him the way people looked at a math equation that didn't add up, and Samuel understood, not for the first time in his life, that some people would always see the color of his skin before they heard the content of his words. Before the officers took the children away, the little girl, Emily, turned around in the back seat of the cruiser and looked at Samuel through the window. One of the officers asked her if the man had done anything to them. Emily shook her head and said in a voice so small it barely carried through the glass, "He bought us hot chocolate." It was the first sentence she had spoken all day. 2 months passed. Samuel went back to his routine work, home porch silence. But something had shifted. He kept thinking about that boy's arm around his sister. He kept thinking about Emily's voice through the glass. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself those kids were in the system now, and the system would take care of them. Then he heard through a church friend who worked at the county office that Emily and David had already been moved through 3 foster homes in 8 weeks. No family wanted both of them, and David refused to be separated from his sister. Every time a placement tried to take just one, David would shut down completely, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, wouldn't move from the front door. So they kept getting sent back, and the file kept getting thicker, and the kids kept getting shuffled like cards that nobody wanted to deal. Samuel filed the adoption paperwork on a Tuesday morning before his shift. The reactions came fast. The social worker assigned to his case, a white woman in her 50s named Diane, looked at him over the top of her glasses with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing. "Mr. Carter, you understand that these children are, well, they're Caucasian. You're aware of that." Samuel looked at her. "I'm aware. And you're a single man living alone in," she glanced at the file, "the South Side neighborhood." "I'm aware of where I live too." The family court judge ordered 3 home inspections instead of the standard one. Samuel's own neighbors, black folks who had known him for years, pulled him aside after church. "Sam, you're bringing trouble into your house. A black man raising 2 white kids in this town, you're painting a target on your back." Samuel heard them. He understood them, and he filed the next round of paperwork anyway. It took 6 months. 6 months of interviews and background checks and home visits and questions that circled the same suspicion, dressed up in different words. But on a bright morning in August of 2004, a judge signed the papers, and Samuel Carter became the legal father of Emily and David. That first night, Samuel set up the spare bedroom with 2 small beds, a nightlight shaped like a star, and a bookshelf he had built himself over the weekend. Emily fell asleep within minutes, the deep, instant sleep of a child who finally felt safe enough to close her eyes. But David lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his body rigid under the covers. Samuel checked on them before turning in. He stood in the doorway watching. David's eyes caught his in the dark. "Are you going to leave like the others?" David's voice was flat, not sad like he was asking about the weather. Samuel didn't answer with words. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room, set it beside David's bed, and sat down. He stayed there the entire night. When David woke up the next morning, Samuel was still sitting in that chair, his head tilted back, asleep but present. And something in David's gray eyes shifted just slightly, like a door that had been locked for a very long time, cracking open by a fraction of an inch. The years that followed were not easy. They were never going to be easy. A black single father raising 2 white children in rural Georgia. That was a sentence that made people uncomfortable no matter which side of the color line they stood on. The first day of school set the tone. Samuel walked Emily and David through the front doors of Macon Elementary, holding each of their hands. The teacher at the welcome desk smiled at the children, then looked up at Samuel and said, "Oh, are you their driver?" "I'm their father," Imam said. The smile didn't vanish so much as rearrange itself into something confused and cautious, the way people's faces change when they encounter something they haven't been taught how to categorize. A white mother near the sign-in table saw the 3 of them together and gently pulled her own daughter closer, as if proximity to Samuel's family was something a child needed to be shielded from. That afternoon, David came home and sat at the kitchen table without touching his snack. "Dad, why does everyone stare at us like that?" Samuel pulled out the chair across from him and sat down so their eyes were level. "Because they haven't seen this before. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, David. It just means we're first." There were other moments, harder ones. When Emily was 9 and David was 11, Samuel attended a parent-teacher conference that he had marked on his calendar 2 weeks in advance. He wore a clean shirt. He brought a folder with both children's report cards, straight A's every term, because he had learned by then that a black father in a white school always needed receipts. A woman named Sandra Mitchell stood up during the open comment portion. She was a well-known parent on the school board, the kind of woman whose opinion moved through the community like weather. She looked directly at Samuel and said loud enough for the room to hear, "Has social services actually vetted this situation properly? A single black man raising 2 white children who doesn't find that unusual." The room held its breath. Samuel felt every pair of eyes on him. He could have shouted. He could have left. Instead, he opened his folder and laid out Emily's and David's academic records on the table. The grades, the teacher comments, the attendance records, the notes from school counselors praising their social development. "This is the only answer I have," he said, "and it's the only answer that matters." Nobody in that room said a word. But the moment that cut deepest, the one that Samuel carried with him for years like a stone in his chest, came when Emily was 15. It was a Thursday evening. Samuel drove to the high school to pick Emily up from drama rehearsal. He waited in the parking lot, leaning against his truck, the way he always did. When Emily came out with a group of friends, one of the girls pointed at Samuel and asked who he was. Emily glanced at her father, then back at her friend and said, "Oh, he's our housekeeper." She said it quickly, casually, the way teenagers toss words like grenades without checking where they land. David heard about it that same night from a classmate who had been there. He confronted Emily in the kitchen, his voice sharp with anger. "He's our father, Emily, our father. How could you say that?" Emily broke down. "You don't understand. You're a boy. Nobody asks you every single day why your dad is black. Nobody whispers about you in the locker room." Samuel was in the hallway. He heard every word. He didn't step in. He walked to the back porch, sat down in the old rocking chair, and stayed there for hours, watching the dark settle over the yard. It was the only time in 21 years of raising those children that Samuel allowed himself to wonder whether his love was actually hurting them, whether his presence in their lives, the color of his skin, the shape of his face, everything that made strangers stare, was a weight they would carry forever and resent him for eventually. 2 days later, Emily found him in the garage fixing a lawnmower that didn't really need fixing. She stood in the doorway for a long time before she spoke. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was scared, but I was wrong." Samuel set down the wrench. "You're not wrong for being scared, sweetheart. You're only wrong if you let fear make your choices for you." Emily nodded. She walked over and hugged him hard the way she used to when she was 5 years old. And the world was just a grocery store bench and a cup of hot chocolate and a stranger who didn't walk away. That lesson fear doesn't get to choose for you would come back around. But not yet. There were good years too. Quiet years. The Christmas when Emily was 11 and David was 13, the plant cut Samuel's hours and money got tight enough that presents weren't possible. Music. So Samuel stayed up until 2 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Eve, building a bookshelf for Emily out of scrap lumber from the plant, and repainting David's old bicycle a shade of blue that almost looked new. On Christmas morning, David unwrapped the bicycle and understood immediately what it meant. Not the paint, but the hours. He didn't say anything. He just put his arms around Samuel and held on. Emily ran to her room and came back with a handmade card she had drawn in crayon. A small house with 3 people standing in front of it. One tall and dark, 2 shorter and light, and underneath, in crooked letters, 2 words are family. Samuel put that card in his wallet. Music. He would carry it there for the next 15 years through every shift at the plant, every Sunday at church, every quiet evening on the porch. It would still be there the night he was arrested. Years later, David graduated from Mercer University School of Law, top of his class valedictorian. Music. Samuel sat in the front row wearing the only suit he owned, the one he had bought secondhand for Linda's funeral, and never had another occasion to wear until this one. When David stood at the podium and addressed the graduating class, he said, "Music. I'm standing here today because one man taught me that justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you build." Samuel lowered his head. For the first time since Linda died, he cried in front of other people. Emily by then was working as an investigative journalist at a newspaper in Atlanta. David was practicing civil rights law in Savannah. The 2 kids that nobody wanted had become exactly the kind of people that Samuel always believed they could be. Music, not because he pushed them, but because he never let go. And then the phone call came. It was a Tuesday night when everything broke. Gerald Whitmore, a white production manager at Harris Lumber, 48 years, music old, was found dead in the plant's warehouse section. Blunt force trauma to the head. The police classified it as homicide within hours. Within 48 hours, Samuel Carter was in handcuffs. The case against him was built on three pillars, and every one of them was thin enough to see through if anyone had bothered to look. First, the plant's electronic badge system, music, showed Samuel was the last employee to swipe out on the night Gerald died. Second, Samuel and Gerald had clashed to music publicly 2 weeks earlier when Samuel discovered that Gerald had been slashing the maintenance budget so severely that critical equipment was failing. Samuel had reported it to the company's board of directors, a move that made him no friends and at least one enemy. Third, a night security guard named Rick Donovan claimed he saw Samuel near the warehouse around the time Gerald was killed. That was it. No DNA, no murder weapon, no surveillance footage, just a badge swiping argument in one man's word against another. Samuel told the detectives the truth he had swiped out, walked to his truck, realized he left his lunchbox inside and gone back for it. He never went near the warehouse. He never saw Gerald. But the truth in Macon, Georgia had a way of bending around a black man like light around a black hole, close enough to touch but never quite reaching him. The public defender assigned to his case came to see him once, a tired man with a briefcase full of other people's problems. He sat across from Samuel in the county jail and laid it out plain. They're pushing for first-degree murder life without parole. My honest advice, plead guilty to a lesser charge, voluntary manslaughter. You'd be looking at 20 years instead of life. Samuel stared at him. I didn't kill anyone. Mr. Carter, I understand that. But the jury pool in this county is what it is. A black man accused of killing a white manager, the math isn't in your favor. Samuel leaned forward. I have spent my entire life teaching my children that the truth matters. That you don't lie, you don't hide, and you don't let fear make your choices. I am not going to plead guilty to something I did not do. Not for 20 years, not for 20 minutes. The public defender withdrew from the case 2 days before trial, citing a scheduling conflict. Samuel was left with no attorney and a trial date that wasn't moving. The call reached Emily first. Pastor Wilkins from their old church in Macon phoned her office in Atlanta on a Wednesday afternoon. Emily, I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. Your father's been arrested. They're saying he killed a man at the plant. Emily was in the middle of the biggest investigative piece of her career, a corruption expose months in the making. She left it on her desk without a second thought and was on the highway to Macon within the hour. David got the news that same evening. He was in Savannah preparing for a civil rights case that had taken him 6 months to build. But when he pulled the court filings for Samuel's case and read through the prosecution's evidence, the lawyer in him saw immediately what the son in him already knew. The entire case rested on circumstantial evidence and a single eyewitness account. No physical evidence, no forensics, nothing that would survive scrutiny in a fair courtroom. He called Emily. This case has holes you could drive a truck through. Someone wanted Dad to take the fall. Emily's voice was steady on the other end of the line. I know. I'm already driving. David understood the risk. Representing his own adoptive father in a murder trial would give the prosecution ammunition. They would call him biased, emotional compromised. But he also understood something else. No lawyer in Macon, Georgia was going to fight with everything they had for a black man accused of killing a white manager in a town where the Harris family name was on half the buildings. If Samuel was going to get a real defense, it would have to come from the people who knew exactly what kind of man he was. Emily and David met at a gas station halfway between Atlanta and Macon. They stood in the parking lot under a flickering light, two grown adults who had once been two cold children on a grocery store bench, and they made their decision without needing many words. They were going back to the town that had judged their family for 21 years. They were going to stand in a courtroom and fight a system that had never been built to protect people who looked like their father. Not because it was safe, not because it was smart, because Samuel Carter had spent his whole life showing them what it looked like to do the right thing when doing nothing would have been so much easier. The trial of Samuel Carter began on a Monday morning in the Bibb County Superior Courthouse, and from the very first hour, the room felt like a verdict waiting to happen. David took his place at the defense table beside his father. He had filed the proper motion, submitted his credentials, and been approved as counsel. But that didn't stop the whispers that rippled through the gallery when the jury saw a young white attorney sit down next to the black defendant and place a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was brief, instinctive, the kind of thing a son does without thinking. But in that courtroom, everything between Samuel and David carried a second meaning, a meaning the prosecution was more than ready to exploit. The man leading the prosecution was Douglas Mercer, a veteran district attorney with a conviction rate that local newspapers loved to print and defense attorneys learned to fear. Mercer was not a villain in any theatrical sense. He didn't sneer or pound tables. He was precise, measured, and deeply effective, the kind of prosecutor who could make circumstantial evidence sound like divine certainty simply by choosing the right words in the right order. Jury selection had already told David everything he needed to know about the fight ahead. The final panel seated 10 white jurors and 2 black jurors. David challenged the composition, arguing it didn't represent the demographics of the county. Judge Robert Harlan, a conservative Macon-born jurist who had sat on that bench for nearly 20 years, denied the challenge without elaboration. David noted it for the record, knowing it would matter later and knowing it didn't matter now. Mercer's opening statement was a masterclass in implication. He never said the word race. He didn't need to. He talked about Samuel's history of conflict with Gerald Whitmore. He talked about opportunity, a man alone in a plant at night. He talked about motive, a maintenance worker who believed his supervisor was cheating him. Every sentence was designed to paint a portrait, and the portrait was always the same one that this country had been painting for centuries: a dangerous black man in a place he shouldn't have been doing something he shouldn't have done. David stood for his opening and went in the opposite direction. No emotion, no story, just a question. "Where is the physical evidence?" he said, looking at each juror in turn. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my client committed murder, but where is the proof? Not the assumptions, the proof. They have a badge swipe that shows a man went to work. They have an argument from 2 weeks ago, and they have one witness whose testimony I will ask you to examine very carefully. That is not a case. That is a story told to fill in the blanks. And in America, we don't convict people based on stories." A few jurors shifted in their seats. Mercer's expression tightened by a fraction. But the trial was young, and opening statements or promises the verdict would depend on whether those promises held. The prosecution called its key witness on the second day. Rick Donovan walked to the stand with the stiff posture of a man who had rehearsed this moment. He was the night security guard at Harris Lumber, the only person who claimed to have seen Samuel near the warehouse on the night Gerald died. Donovan's direct testimony was simple and clear. He stated that at approximately 10:15 on the night in question, he observed Samuel Carter walking toward the warehouse section of the plant. He recognized him by his build and his gait. He was certain. David let the words settle before he stood for cross-examination. He carried a single sheet of paper, a printed layout of this Harris Lumber facility. "Mr. Donovan, where exactly were you when you say you saw my client?" Donovan answered without hesitation. "At the main gate security station." David held up the facility map so the jury could see it. "The main gate security station is here," he said, pointing. "The warehouse entrance is here. That's over 200 yards away on the other side of 2 manufacturing buildings. There is no direct line of sight between these 2 points." He turned to Donovan. "You're telling this court that you identified a specific individual from over 200 yards away at night through 2 buildings." Donovan's confidence wavered. "I recognized his walk. I've worked with him for years." David repeated the words slowly. "His walk. At night. From 200 yards. He let the jury sit with that, then moved on. "Mr. Donovan, isn't it true that 1 week after Gerald Whitmore's death, you were promoted to head of the night security team?" Donovan blinked. "That was a routine promotion." "Who signed the promotion order?" Donovan looked toward the prosecution table before answering. "Franklin Harris, the vice president of operations." David nodded. "Franklin Harris, the son of the plant's owner?" the same Franklin Harris who oversees all personnel decisions at the facility. He didn't ask another question. He simply said no further questions and sat down. The seed had been planted. It was small and the jury might not have noticed it yet, but seeds don't need to be noticed to grow. While David fought in the courtroom, Emily worked outside of it. She had taken leave from her newspaper in Atlanta, though leave was a generous word for what amounted to walking away from a career-defining story mid-draft. She didn't care. Stories could wait. Her father couldn't. Emily started where any good investigative journalist starts, with the money. She pulled publicly available financial records for Harris, lumber cross-referenced vendor contracts with actual maintenance logs, and began interviewing current and former employees who were willing to talk. What she found was bigger than a single murder. Gerald Whitmore had not just been cutting the maintenance budget. Gerald, working alongside Franklin Harris, had been running a systematic fraud, inflating repair costs on paper, contracting with shell vendors, and pocketing the difference. The scheme had been operating for at least 5 years, draining hundreds of thousands of dollars from the company, while actual equipment deteriorated to dangerous levels. Samuel had stumbled onto the edge of the scheme without knowing its full scope. As maintenance crew leader, he saw equipment logged as replaced that was clearly original, rusted, failing, held together with improvised repairs. He reported the discrepancies to Gerald first. Gerald dismissed him, so Samuel went over Gerald's head and reported directly to the board of directors, which meant his complaint landed on the desk of Franklin Harris, the very person profiting from the fraud. 2 weeks before Gerald's death, Samuel had gone one step further. He sent an email to the Georgia State Workplace Safety Inspection Board requesting an audit of the plant's equipment. If that audit had happened, the entire fraud would have unraveled and both Gerald and Franklin would have faced criminal prosecution. Emily called David from her hotel room at midnight, her voice tight with the controlled urgency of someone holding a live wire. David, this wasn't random. Gerald and Franklin Harris were stealing from their own company for years. Dad found out and reported it. 2 weeks before Gerald died, Dad contacted the state inspection board. If that inspection went through, Franklin was finished. David was quiet on the other end of the line, processing. Emily continued. Someone killed Gerald to shut down the fraud trail before the inspectors arrived, and they needed a fall guy. Someone who already had a public conflict with Gerald. Someone the town would be ready to believe was guilty. Dad was perfect. He had the argument on record, the badge swipe that put him at the plant that night, and David finished the sentence. And he was black in a county where that's still the most damning evidence of all. The picture was coming into focus, but having a theory and proving it in court were two entirely different things, and the distance between them was about to become painfully clear. Franklin Harris did not become a powerful man by being careless. Within days of Emily's inquiries, the pressure campaign began. 2 plant workers who had initially agreed to speak with Emily about the maintenance fraud suddenly went silent. One of them called her from an unknown number and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I have a family. I can't be part of this. I'm sorry." The line went dead. Then Emily's managing editor in Atlanta called. His tone was different than usual, careful, measured, the kind of voice people use when they're delivering someone else's message. "Emily, you're on personal leave. You are not authorized to conduct investigations on behalf of the paper during your leave. If you're using your press credentials to interfere with an active criminal, trial will need to review your employment status." Emily understood what that meant. Someone with influence had made a phone call to the paper. Someone wanted her to stop digging. Inside the courtroom, Mercer shifted tactics. He could feel the case softening at the edges, and he responded the way skilled prosecutors do, by attacking the defense's credibility rather than strengthening his own evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mercer said during a mid-trial motion hearing, "I want to draw your attention to an unusual aspect of this case. The defense attorney is not an impartial advocate. He is the adopted son of the defendant. Every argument he presents, every objection he raises, is colored by personal attachment, not by facts. I urge you to weigh his words accordingly." It was a calculated strike. and it put David in an impossible position. If he responded with emotion, he proved Mercer's point. If he remained too cold, too clinical, he risked losing the human connection with the jury that was his only real advantage. David chose his words with surgical care. The prosecution suggests that my relationship with my client compromises my judgment. I would suggest the opposite. I know this man, I know his character, and more importantly, I know the evidence, or rather the lack of it. Personal knowledge of a defendant's integrity is not a weakness. It is exactly what this jury needs to hear. It was a strong response, but David could feel the ground shifting beneath him, and he wasn't sure it was shifting in the right direction. The weight fell heaviest on Samuel. In the county jail, stripped of his routine, separated from everything that had given his life meaning for 21 years, Samuel began to fold inward. He barely ate. He spoke less. During visitation, David sat across from him, separated by a plexiglass divider, and saw something in his father's eyes that he had never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but a deep, quiet exhaustion that looked like surrender. "I want you and Emily to stop," Samuel said. His voice was steady, but the words were heavy. "I don't want you two destroying your careers over this. You've worked too hard, both of you." David placed his hand flat against the glass. "Dad, you didn't quit when the entire town said you had no business raising us. You didn't quit when Sandra Mitchell humiliated you at that school meeting. You didn't quit when Emily broke your heart, and you sat on that porch all night and still showed up the next morning as her father. So don't ask me to quit now." On the other side of the glass, Samuel looked at David's hand pressed against the divider. He raised his own hand and placed it against the same spot, their palms separated by an inch of plexiglass and 21 years of everything they had survived together. That night, Emily and David sat in the parking lot of their motel in Macon and had the hardest conversation of their lives. They disagreed sharply, genuinely, about what to do next. Emily wanted to go public immediately. Take the financial records, the vendor fraud, the timeline connecting Franklin Harris to the cover-up and publish it. Force the story into the open where public pressure could do what the courtroom wasn't doing. "If I run this story, every news outlet in Georgia picks it up by morning. The judge can't ignore it. The jury can't unsee it." David shook his head. "If you publish before I present it in court, Mercer files for a mistrial. He argues the jury has been tainted by media coverage. The judge grants it, and Dad sits in jail for another 6 months, maybe a year, waiting for a new trial. He won't survive that, Emily. Not mentally." Emily shot back. "And if you try to present it in court and the judge shuts you down, what then? At least if the public knows there's accountability." "I'm his lawyer, Emily. I need you to trust me." Emily stared at the cracked asphalt of the parking lot for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I do trust you, but I also remember sitting in the hallway and hearing Dad on the porch that night, the night I called him our housekeeper. He sat out there alone for hours because I was too ashamed to call him my father. I will not let anyone make him sit alone again." The words landed somewhere deep in David's chest, in a place that legal training couldn't reach. They agreed on a plan. David would file a motion to introduce the new evidence in court. If the judge accepted it, they would fight the battle inside the system. Music. If the judge rejected it, Emily would publish within the hour. David filed the motion the next morning. Music. He laid it all out: the financial fraud, the shell vendors, Samuel's email to the state inspection board, the suspicious timing of Rick Donovan's promotion. He argued that this evidence established an alternative motive for Gerald Whitmore's murder and directly undermined the prosecution's narrative. Judge Harlan read the motion in his chambers for 45 minutes. When he returned to the bench, his face gave nothing away. "The defense's motion to introduce supplementary evidence is denied," he said. "The materials presented relate to corporate financial irregularities which are not within the scope of this murder trial. They do not constitute exculpatory evidence under the standard required by this hymn, like a physical weight." He knew the judge wasn't entirely wrong on the legal technicality, but he also knew that without the fraud evidence, all he had was the weakness of the prosecution's case. And in a courtroom where the defendant was black and the victim was white, weakness of evidence wasn't always enough. Mercer delivered his closing argument that afternoon with the confidence of a man who knew the wind was at his back. He spoke about duty, about community safety, about the need to hold people accountable. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. Every word was calibrated to land in the space between evidence and fear, the space where prejudice lives and convictions are born. The jury filed into the deliberation room. David sat beside Samuel at the defense table, both of them staring straight ahead. Emily sat in the gallery row directly behind them, her phone gripped in her hand with her editor's number already pulled up her finger hovering over the call button. 4 hours passed. Then the jury door opened and the foreperson stood. Your Honor, we have been unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Harlan called for order and instructed the jury to resume deliberations the following morning. If they remained deadlocked, he would consider declaring a mistrial, which meant Mercer could request a new trial, and the entire process would begin again from nothing. Samuel would stay in jail. The weeks would become months. The months might become a year. That evening, guards escorted Samuel back to his cell. The courthouse emptied. The lawyers packed their briefcases. The reporters filed their stories. And in a 6-by-8 room, with a concrete floor and a single overhead light, Samuel Carter sat on the edge of his cot and reached into his wallet, the same worn leather wallet he had carried for over 20 years, and pulled out a piece of paper creased and softened by 15 years of being folded and unfolded and held. A handmade card drawn in crayon by an 11-year-old girl who had just opened a bookshelf built by her father's hands on a Christmas morning when money was too tight for real presents. 3 figures, standing in front of the small house, one tall and dark, 2 shorter and light. 2 words in crooked childish handwriting, our family. Samuel held the card under the thin light that leaked through the bars from the corridor. He traced the crayon lines with his fingertip. Then he closed his eyes and pressed the card against his chest, and the cell went quiet in the way that only a room built for punishment can be quiet, completely mercilessly, without comfort. Outside somewhere in a motel room in Macon, Emily Carter was not sleeping. She was staring at a ceiling and making a decision that no journalism school had ever prepared her for. The jury was deadlocked. The judge had shut them out. The legal road was narrowing to a point, but Emily was not just a journalist. She was the daughter of a man who had taught her by word and by example, through sacrifice and through silence, that you don't wait for someone else to do the right thing. You do it yourself even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. She picked up her phone, but she didn't call her editor. She scrolled to a different name, a name she had found buried in Harris Lumber's old employee records 3 days earlier and hadn't known what to do with until now. Martha Jennings, former administrative secretary at Harris Lumber, 18 years at the company, quietly forced into early retirement 2 months ago, right after Gerald Whitmore's death. Emily didn't know what Martha Jennings knew. She didn't know if the woman would even open her door, but she knew that somewhere in this town there was a truth that hadn't been spoken yet. And she was going to find it tonight because her father was sitting alone in a cell with a crayon drawing pressed against his heart. And Emily had made a promise to herself that she would never let him sit alone again. Emily drove to Martha Jennings' house at 11 o'clock that night. It was a small bungalow on a quiet street at the edge of town, the kind of house that blends into its surroundings so completely that you could drive past it 100 times and never remember it was there. The porch light was off. The curtains were drawn. Everything about the place said go away. Emily knocked anyway. No answer. She knocked again, then spoke through the door, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that was riding on this moment. Mrs. Jennings, my name is Emily Carter. I know you worked at Harris Lumber for 18 years, and I know you were pushed out right after Gerald Whitmore died. I'm not here as a reporter. I'm here as a daughter. My father is sitting in a jail cell tonight for something he didn't do, and I believe you know something that could help him. The house stayed dark. The street was silent. Emily stood on that porch and felt the seconds stretch into something unbearable. Then the deadbolt turned and the door opened. Martha Jennings was in her early 60s with gray hair pulled back and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked at Emily the way people look at something they've been expecting and dreading in equal measure, with recognition and resignation. She didn't invite Emily inside right away. She stood in the doorway and studied the young woman's face, searching for something. Whatever she found there, it was enough. She stepped aside and let Emily in. What Martha told her changed everything. On the night Gerald Whitmore died, Martha had gone back to the plant after hours to retrieve personal documents from her desk. She was already being pressured to retire early and wanted to secure her files before they disappeared. While walking through the back corridor near the warehouse, she saw Franklin Harris coming from the direction of the loading dock. His clothes were disheveled, his face was flushed, and his hands were shaking. When he saw Martha, he stopped dead. "You were never here tonight." Franklin had told her, not a request, a command. "Do you understand me, Martha? You were never here." 2 days later, Martha received official notice of her early retirement. Her pension, the one she had spent 18 years earning, was tied to a company-administered plan that Franklin controlled. The message was clear without ever being spoken aloud. "Be quiet, keep your pension. Talk and lose everything." Emily asked Martha why she hadn't gone to the police. Martha looked at her hands folded in her lap and said, "Because in this town, when the Harris family tells you to be quiet, you stay quiet. That's how it's always been. That's how it works." Emily leaned forward. "Mrs. Jennings, it doesn't have to work that way tomorrow." Martha looked up at Emily, a young woman who had driven across the state, walked away from her career and knocked on a stranger's door at 11 o'clock at night to save a man who wasn't even the same color as her, but was in every way that mattered, her father. And Martha understood something that she had been trying to avoid understanding for months. Silence was not safety. Silence was complicity. She agreed to testify. The next morning, David filed an emergency motion to call a new witness before the jury resumed deliberations. Mercer was on his feet immediately, objecting with a fury that rattled the windows. "This is a stalling tactic, Your Honor. The defense had every opportunity to present witnesses during the trial. Introducing a new witness at this stage is procedurally improper and prejudicial to the prosecution." David stood his ground. He cited Brady versus Maryland, the landmark Supreme Court ruling that requires the prosecution to disclose all evidence favorable to the defendant. He argued that Martha Jennings' testimony was directly relevant to the events of the night in question, and that suppressing it would constitute a violation of Samuel's constitutional rights. "Your Honor, this witness was at the crime scene on the night of the murder. She has firsthand testimony about the movements of another individual near the warehouse at the time of Gerald Whitmore's death. If this court denies Mr. Carter the right to present this testimony, it denies him the right to a fair trial, and any verdict this jury delivers will be subject to reversal on appeal." Judge Harlan sat behind his bench and weighed two things: his instinct to maintain control of his courtroom and his awareness that an appellate court would not look kindly on a judge who blocked exculpatory eyewitness testimony in a murder trial. The calculation was not about justice. It was about legacy, but sometimes the right outcome arrives through imperfect doors. "The motion is granted," Judge Harlan said. "The witness will be heard." Martha Jennings took the stand in a courtroom so quiet that every footstep she took echoed off the walls. She was not a dramatic witness. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply told the truth in plain, clear language, the way a woman who has spent 18 years keeping careful records tells you what she saw when she saw it. She described Franklin Harris emerging from the warehouse area. She described his appearance, the disheveled clothes, the shaking hands. She recounted his exact words, "You were never here tonight." And she explained without self-pity and without excuses why she had stayed silent: the pension, the pressure, the unspoken rules of a company town where one family held all the cards. Mercer cross-examined her hard. "Mrs. Jennings, why should this jury believe a story you waited months to tell? Isn't it possible you're fabricating this account out of resentment toward a company that let you go? Martha looked at the prosecutor, then turned to face the jury directly. I kept quiet because I was afraid, because that's what people do in this town. When the Harris family says be quiet, they stay quiet. I'm not proud of that, but I'm here now because I watched a man get charged with something he didn't do, and my silence was helping it happen. When Mercer sat down, the courtroom felt different. Something in the air had shifted, not dramatically, not with a crack of thunder, but quietly the way pressure changes before a storm breaks. David rose for his final words to the jury. He did not shout. He did not perform. He spoke the way Samuel had taught him to speak plainly, directly, as if truth didn't need decoration to be convincing. My father, Samuel Carter, spent 21 years raising two children that the world said were not his to raise. He never asked why he should. He never asked what he'd get in return. And when he discovered that equipment at his workplace was failing because someone was stealing money that should have gone to safety repairs, he didn't stay quiet. He reported it. He reported it because that is who he is, a man who does the right thing even when the right thing has a cost. That cost is why he's sitting here today, not because of evidence, not because of proof, because he was convenient, because a powerful man needed someone to blame. And Samuel Carter, a black man in a town that has never quite figured out what to do with black men who don't stay in their lane, was the easiest target available. You have heard the prosecution's case. You have heard a badge swipe that proves nothing except that my client went to work that day. You have heard a witness whose testimony cannot survive basic geography. And now you have heard from a woman who saw with her own eyes another man, leaving the scene of the crime, a man with motive, with opportunity, and with the power to make everyone around him stay silent. Justice is not something you wait for. It is something you build. Today you are the builders. David sat down beside his father. Samuel looked at him, not with hope, not with fear, but with the expression of a man seeing something he built standing on its own for the first time. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. When they filed back in the foreperson, an older white woman who had sat through every day of the trial with an unreadable face stood and unfolded a single piece of paper. On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. Samuel did not move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his hands flat on the table. David placed a hand on his father's shoulder, the same gesture from the first day of the trial, and this time neither of them let go. Emily came from the gallery and wrapped her arms around both of them, and for a long moment, the three of them held each other in the middle of a courtroom that had tried to tear them apart. Samuel opened his eyes, looked at his children, both of them crying. Both of them strong in ways that still surprised him even after all these years, and said the first words that came to him, "You two grew up on me." Emily laughed through her tears, and the sound filled the courtroom the way Linda's laugh used to fill a room, completely without apology. In the weeks that followed, Emily's investigation was published. The story detailed the financial fraud at Harris Lumber, the scheme between Gerald Whitmore and Franklin Harris, and the systematic cover-up that had nearly sent an innocent man to prison for life. Federal investigators opened a case. Franklin Harris was indicted on charges of fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. Rick Donovan pleaded guilty to perjury in exchange for a reduced sentence. Samuel went home. The small house on the south side of Macon was older now, the porch a little more weathered, the paint a little more faded. But the family photo still hung in the hallway, the same one that had been there for 21 years. Emily took the crayon card, "Our Family," and had it sealed in a clear protective case. She placed it on the bookshelf that Samuel had built for her out of scrap lumber on a Christmas morning when money was tight and love was the only currency they had. The card sat there in its case, the crayon lines still bright enough to read after all these years, a relic from a time when a little girl drew the only truth she knew. 3 people, 1 house, in a word that no courtroom, no system, music, and no amount of prejudice had ever managed to take away from them. Family. Samuel sat on his porch that evening, and watched the sun go down the way he had done 1,000 times before. Emily sat on the steps beside him, leaned against the railing. Nobody spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Some things don't require words, they just require presence. When Samuel finally broke the silence, he said something that neither of his children expected. "People always ask me why I adopted you two. I never had a good answer, but I think I do now." He looked at them both. "I adopted you because I needed you more than you ever needed me." Emily smiled and shook her head. That's the most ridiculous and truest thing you've ever said. 21 years earlier, a man had chosen to love two children that the world said weren't his. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. Music. He simply showed up every single day and built something that everyone told him couldn't last a family, that didn't match in a town that didn't approve. Music held together by nothing more than the stubborn, quiet conviction that love doesn't need permission. Justice doesn't wait for an invitation. And in the end, the thing he built was the only thing strong enough to save him. Not the law, not the system, not the town that watched him struggle for 2 decades and never once offered to help. His children, the ones nobody wanted, the ones he chose. They saved him the same way he had saved them, not with grand gestures, but with the simple, ferocious refusal to let go. And maybe that's the thing worth remembering about this story, not the courtroom, not the verdict, not even the injustice. The thing worth remembering is that somewhere out there right now, someone is making a choice to love a person that the world says isn't theirs to love. And that choice, as quiet and unremarkable as it might seem today, might be the one thing that saves them both 21 years from now. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about the people who showed up for you or the people you've shown up for, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me who's your Samuel. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Stories like this one deserve to be heard, and you being here is what makes that possible.